This is TLV1.
Hi, thank you for tuning in to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Gilad Halpern, and this is a message to all our listeners in New York. Join me for a live recording of the podcast on Sunday, the 11th of June, at Hebrew Union College in Manhattan. I'll be speaking to Yale University historian Professor Timothy Snyder about his new book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. For more details, check out our website or the Tel Aviv Review Facebook page. Also, on Thursday, the 15th of June, Yeshiva University professor Jeffrey Gurok, the author of The Jews of Harlem, will be leading a walking tour of Jewish Harlem, especially for friends of the Tel Aviv Review. If you're interested in joining, please send me an email to gilad, Gilad, at tlv1.fm. I look forward to seeing you all.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a sociologist teaching at the School of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He specializes in religious life and religious groups in Israel. We are here to discuss a paper that he recently published in the new issue of my, and of course everybody's, favorite journal, the Israel Studies Review. The paper is entitled From Yehuda Etzion to Yehuda Glick, From Redemptive Revolution to Human Rights on the Temple Mount. Dr. Shlomo Fischer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you describe Yehuda Etzion and Yehuda Glick as the two bookends of a process that you describe in the article. What can you tell us about them specifically and why you chose them for the title and as the centerpieces of your article?
Well, Yehuda Etzion is extremely important, mainly for his thought. He went to jail for doing extreme things, but the extreme things didn't really turn out. I'm not sure how gifted a terrorist he really is. Yeah,
just to tell our listeners that he belonged to a Jewish terrorist group in the early 80s.
Right.
They called him the Jewish Underground.
And he hatched a plot to blow up the Dome of the Rock on Temple Mount. And certain preliminary steps were taken to implement it, but it was never accomplished. And he was picked up by the General Security Services, the Shabak, in 1984. The actual plot was carried out more in 1982, but when they picked everybody up from the Jewish Underground, they picked him up as well. And the interesting thing about him is that while he was in jail, he was convicted and he was in jail, he wrote 3 articles which basically laid out very interesting revolutionary ideology, which I've been arguing over the past years has really become, in one fashion or another, the property of so-called extremist groups, Jewish groups in Israel, right-wing extremist Jewish groups in Israel.
And what were the tenets of this ideology?
Well, what's the most interesting here is that it's really the authority of the engagé activist and the religious authority of the engagé activist, and which basically states that in the act of engagement, the act of hechaltzut, of self-enlistment, the activist, if it's done spontaneously and if it's done in one seamless action, then the activist links up to what Jean-Jacques Rousseau called the general will, which is really the inner will of the Jewish people, which is really God's will, and even hooks up to what Etzion called the lower rungs of prophecy. So that's based on Shabtai Ben-Dov. That's based on a theoretician who was active in Lehi.
In the 1940s. In
the 1940s, and afterwards lived in Israel. He died in 1981, I think. And he was he was perfectly respectable when he lived in Israel. He was the Yoetz Mishpati of Misrad HaTasiyah, Meschar V'Tayarut.
Government official.
Yeah, so he was perfectly respectable. But he continued to write and think about these issues. And it was he who developed the theory of, the revolutionary theory of charisma, which is that charisma is real. Charisma is not only a sociological category that Max Weber invented. It's rather, you take the brackets off, you take phenomenological brackets off. When sociologists talk about religious phenomena, so they don't make claims as to that these religious phenomena are real, right? Jeanne d'Arc, right? Joan of Arc, right? So Joan d'Arc had, heard instructions from the Virgin Mary. Well, did she really hear instructions from the Virgin Mary? So most sociologists will be agnostic, as far as that's concerned.
But it doesn't matter for the sociologists,
right?
Whether she did or didn't.
But for Shabtai Bendov and people like that, that's real. It's not. It has. Right. It actually happened, and charisma is actually real, and hence people. And he included Jeanne d'Arc in his writing and people like that. Mm-hmm. People actually have access to prophecy, to divine guidance, and things of that sort.
But what are really the origins of that kind of thought? Because Lehi wasn't a religious group, yet the Jewish underground and Gush Emunim and those people were deeply, deeply religious. Was it more religious or more nationalistic, secular kind of ideology?
Let's put it this way. I mean, it's very difficult. These categories are somewhat artificial when applied to groups, modern religious nationalist groups in general. This all starts with Rav Kook. I mean, it starts with the theories of Jewish nationalism. For example, I pointed out earlier that there's this notion of the general will. So the notion of the general will, if you don't go back to its prehistory in medieval thought, is associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is, as it were, a secular thinker. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless,
and the liberal universalist. I mean, but that's perhaps another aspect to it, isn't it?
What? That's a whole question as to whether Rousseau. I mean, Yaakov Leib Talmon wrote a very famous book called "The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy" in the 1950s. The historian Hebrew University, and it's a book that used to be read by all college freshmen in the United States. Mm-hmm. And there, Talmon shows the origins of modern totalitarianism, especially communist totalitarianism, in the thought of Rousseau. So the real question about the general will is it something that only an elite knows, i.e. Robespierre, Lenin, Mao Zedong, or is it something that is that the expressed general will of the masses, the empirical general will, when you go to the polls? Right? So Rav Kook adopted this into his theology. I can explain very briefly why he adopted this.
Please do.
Into his theology. Because there's a central problem. When you take religion and nationalism, there's a central theological problem. And that central theological problem is who is in the final analysis is the sovereign. Is God the sovereign or the nation is the sovereign? Modern nationalism tends to award sovereignty to the nation. And as people from Agudat Yisrael, from the ultra-Orthodox community, had pointed out at the time, this is an affront to religion. So Rav Kook had to square the circle. So what he did was that he identified the national will, the authentic national will, with God's will, and saying that they both are basically pointing to the same thing and there's no contradiction. Mm-hmm. And the way he did that was through the theory of the general will. If the will is in fact general, if it's not any person's subjective, private, particular will, but it belongs to everybody, then that's the national will, that's the international will, and that could be said to represent God's will.
So what was Etzion's novelty?
So Etzion took this notion and then said the person who, in empirical fact, has this will, right? This is the question in the entire European revolutionary tradition. Who has the general will, right? So people like Robespierre said, we have the general will, and we'll send to the guillotine anybody who opposes us. Mm-hmm. And there are other people who said, no, the people have the general will. They have to listen, go to elections and see what the people say, right? So Etzion claimed, much more in the tradition of Robespierre and Lenin, Etzion claimed, taking from Shabtai Bendov, that the activist has the general will. Mm. The activist, when he acts spontaneously in the general interest, basically hooks up to the general will. That means that's a huge revolutionary thought within religion, because it means rabbis don't have the general will. Talmidei Chachamim, learned people who know the Torah, don't have the general will, don't really know the will of God. Who knows the will of God? The kids.
Mm-hmm. So it was basically, I wouldn't say fascism, but totalitarianism with a kippah, wasn't it?
It's European revolutionary avant-gardism with a kippah. Right. Whether that will actually lead to totalitarianism or not, I leave as an open question. But it's definitely Mati Karpel, who was a continuer. I mean, the person, he wrote this book in 2001, I think 2002, called The Emuni Revolution. So the people who are most quoted, the non-Torani authorities, the non-Jewish authorities, who are most quoted are Lenin and Stalin. Mm-hmm. Because these are people who actually know how to do a revolution. I mean, and quoted approvingly, like, this is how you do it. I mean, this is This is what this amounts to. So you have this very interesting melding of European extremist, what we would call secular, fascist and communist avant-gardism, merging with Jewish, so-called Jewish extremism or Jewish nationalism, extreme Jewish nationalism.
And how did we get from him to Yehuda Glick, who we should say is currently a Likud a member of Knesset?
Right.
He was one of the activists who's most associated with the Temple Mount movement.
Right, but Yehuda Glick really is, so you have, in Yehuda Glick's, let's put it this way, at a certain point, people like Moti Karpel and Etzion himself, etc., become again interested in Temple Mount. Temple Mount is a very important symbol, and one of the themes that Etzion and Shabtai Ben-Dov devoted themselves to is what's the nature of Zionism? What do we want from Zionism? What's the nature of Zionism? So, we were brought up to believe that, sort of standard Zionist historiography and discourse sort of says that Zionism is here to solve the Jewish problem. It's here to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. It's here to solve the problem of the Jews in the modern world, etc., etc. That's sort of been the major chord of how Zionism was conceived.
Mm-hmm. Especially the secular mainstream.
Right. Theodor Herzl came to solve the Jewish problem, and etc., etc. Ben-Dov and Etzion explicitly argue with that. And say that's indeed the hegemonic institutionalized version of Zionism. It's wrong.
But didn't Rav Kook say it back in his day?
To solve the Jewish problem?
No, to add another layer to solving the Jewish problem.
Right. But he never. Yes, it is in Rav Kook in some sense. Yes, in the sense of, and this is something that it's of course shared by all religious Zionists, that there is some connection to the historical process of redemption, etc., etc. But Etzion and Ben-Dov actually formulated explicitly that the real program of Zionism is the restorative utopian hope. And what they called the restoration of the standard of Israel, the standard life of Israel. They didn't really mean to go back to ancient practice, but they meant ancient institutions revived in a modern context,
such as
Sanhedrin, temple, things
okay.
like that. Mm-hmm. How exactly that would play out. I think they left open because they didn't. They left. Ben-Dov, as a high government official, also contributed kinds of standard articles to Mishpat Ivri, to Jewish law, and what kinds of changes it would have to undergo in a modern state, etc., etc. He wasn't oblivious to the fact that we're living in a modern state and that things have to be reformulated.
Was that a minority position within religious Zionism?
Well, let's put it this way: religious Zionism as a whole, especially since 1967, since the mid-'60s, as a whole tends to think of the Zionist movement and the founding of the State of Israel as a historical process that will eventually lead to some sort of redemptive.
Right. But does that mean in practice that at some point we will have to scrap the Knesset and restate the Sanhedrin?
Yeah, but then where the points of argument are how acute is it, and does it have to be done tomorrow, and what steps do we take in order to achieve that? And the majority position is that eventually by education and by the people the people of Israel will come to realize that this is what they're about and this is what they're doing, and they'll do this of their own initiative, free will, etc., etc. So that you can take Naftali Bennett and what he's doing in Misrad HaChinuch to a certain extent as the evolutionary aspect of this program. Most people are much more evolutionary, not revolutionary with an R, but evolutionary with an E. So eventually, if there's if the state becomes more Jewishly, has more greater Jewish character and greater education, etc., etc., then people will come to understand what their place is in history.
So back to Yehuda Glick.
Right.
What elements of
Yehuda Glick joined the Temple Institute at the beginning of his career, and and the Temple Institute sort of adopts many of the Etzion-like tenets about the discourse of restoration and discourse of that sort. But as I pointed out in the article, what's important to realize is that, first of all, this revolutionary avant-gardism itself encapsulates a very oppositionary, anti-establishment way of thinking. And it's anti-establishment, hence the political establishment and also of the religious establishment. And it's very, how shall I say, it's anti-establishment. It's very jealous of its own autonomy, and it's very jealous of its own prerogatives, and it's very and it thinks that and it says that people have to be autonomous and that people have to not give in to authority. So there's an element within that which became stronger over the years of anti-establishmentism, and that's sort of one strand that could lead to a form of liberalism.
Or are they some sort of like libertarian, as we see in the Christian world?
No. So you have in some of the chavot, in some of the ranches or outposts that are associated with hilltop youth and stuff like that, you have libertarian tendencies. And you have libertarian, but the issue is, of course, that these libertarian tendencies tend to be arrogated just to one group, us. I mean,
sure,
and not anybody else. So then the question is, how do you universalize it? So that's when I started to talk about that. That Etzion is the product of two streams. He's the product of he's clearly linked into the tradition that Etzion started of the autonomous activist, etc. But he's also, that's the second part of the article, he's also linked into a different tradition. That's the tradition which we now associate with two people who are very interesting, influential, but outlying Jewish thinkers, Rabbi Shagar and Rabbi Froman. And so we have these two streams within religious Zionism, and Shagar, two avant-garde streams, I would say, within religious Zionism. Almost the opposite. You have the Etzion activist stream, and you have, which is Monty Karpel and Feiglin and all those people that we associate with activism, even to Hilltop Youth, that we associate with a sort of activism. Then there's another stream, which is in many ways a sort of opposite of this first stream, and that's the stream of Rav Shagar and Rav Fruman, which is open to the acceptance of the other. And that's and just to locate this group, that's the group, some of whose members are affiliated with Eretz Shalom and Land of Peace and Moledet Achat Shtei Medinot. So about one homeland, two states. And that's, in other words, sort of these ideas, which are very radical and interesting, of like sort of sharing the same homeland in a Jewish and Palestinian, two states in the same territory of greater
But in
Israel,
short, they
Palestine.
recognize the Palestinians and wish to engage with them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So hence you get in a figure like Yehuda Glick, you get a sort of merger of both streams. That you have Shagar and Froman talk explicitly about recognition of the Palestinian other, of engagement with him, of learning from him, of partnership, of things like that. They have a very different take on what a political settlement looks like than the conventional secular Israeli left. The secular Israeli left has a take of separation, of divorce. You're there and we're here, and
two states separated by a fence.
By a fence, and two different populations separated by a fence. And some people take the inner motivation of the Israeli left as basically racist. In other words, they don't want to be with the Arabs, they want to be with the Palestinians, they want to get rid of the Palestinians. And if the price of that is to give them some part of the land of Israel, so we'll do that. But, and that's almost explicit in Chaim Ramon's, in this type of discourse that Chaim Ramon promotes.
Yeah, the left of center, Labour Party, etc. Yeah.
Right. And Froman explicitly says that's unacceptable.
But how are these two streams reconcilable at all? It seems like they're really polar opposites.
No, so the reconcilability is precisely what Yehuda Glick attempts, which is that, I have a right to worship on Temple Mount, but everybody else does as well. And I don't want to destroy Al-Aqsa. On the contrary, I want to uphold the rights of Al-Aqsa. I want to uphold the rights of women. But it's everybody. It's Women of the Wall, and it's the Reform Jews, and it's everybody. Anybody who wants to pray and worship on the Temple Mount or in the Kotel area or in the Wailing Wall area should be allowed to do so. These are fundamental human rights, and we can't deny them to anybody. So if I want to grant these rights to Muslims, then Jews have to have these rights as well, and there's no way that you can deny me these kinds of rights.
So it seems like it's more of a liberal stance than a
That's
religious
what I said.
one.
It's a human. Well, I don't know if it's liberal. It's radical in a certain sense because it's very. I alluded to this in the article. There was a panel held in the municipality in which there was a representative of the organization Iramim, which is sort of leftist organization in Jerusalem, which whose aim is to maintain the balance in Jerusalem so that a peace accord could happen within Jerusalem. And this guy kept on bringing prudential arguments that if you bring Jewish worshippers up the Temple Mount, the Temple Mount will explode. There'll be a war. There'll be thousands of people, etc. All these sort of prudential types of arguments, and Yehuda Glick would have none of it. He said, "Listen, these are absolute rights. What are you giving me this bourgeois, prudential type of arguments? These rights are absolute. I mean, you can't deny people the right to worship.
Sure, but among some of the Temple Mount activists,
right? Not everybody's Yehuda Glick. You have to remember that.
That's what I'm saying. So, if you bring people on, if they do have universal rights, and that's all fine and dandy.
So you say anybody who makes trouble, the police will take care of him. But that's not a reason to deny me or anybody else the right to worship on Temple Mount. It's free. I mean, this is theoretically a democracy. I mean, and people should have the right to worship.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you, it's extremely unpleasant going through what the police make you go through when you go up. I mean,
sure.
Personally, I mean, I can tell you that, and I went up with a group. I was invited by the Waqf, and I went up in total total coordination with the Waqf and with the police, and it was extraordinarily unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. The Temple Mount has undergone some sort of renaissance within Jewish activism and also theology. I mean, going up to Temple Mount wasn't like a prime command, quite the contrary.
Right.
How did that come about?
I think it really came about because people started to realize that Temple Mount was the symbol of the type of Zionism that they're talking about. In other words, if you're talking about Zionism in terms of not solving the Jewish problem, not providing for Jewish defense, not doing all those things that we think of, Herzl, Ben Gurion, all that, but as restoring a sort of redemptive utopia, then, everything else can be construed in sort of defense terms, right? So if you do, Judea and Samaria can be construed as, well, it's prudential. We want to keep, the mountaintops in Samaria under IDF control. So that's why we have settlements, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to emphasize that our Zionism is differently based, and it's not based on your solving the Jewish problem type discourse, but it's based on redemptive utopian discourse, then the symbol of that, because it has no strategic value, it only has symbolic value, is the Temple Mount.
And also because it's a challenge. I mean,
the
Western Wall is too accessible, right? Anyone could go to the Western Wall, and it's no longer a challenge. It's like climbing the Everest.
Then you get into all these symbolics that who has more. This is the Middle East, so these symbolics mean things, who's on top, who's on the bottom. Mm-hmm. So the Muslims are on the mountain, we're in the valley, and they look down upon us, etc. But that's all secondary.
But we should mention that there have been halachic restrictions about visiting.
Yeah, of course.
It's not just a political issue.
And Etzion, who writes very well, of course, is totally aware of the irony that the very letter of Rav Kook that he bases a lot of his work on, of the general will, etc., Rav Kook explicitly warns against going on Temple Mountain as a religious prohibition.
Mm-hmm. Why?
So, because the cultic religious prohibition of going up into as the areas where the Beit HaMikdash, where the temple actually was, right? The second temple, first temple and the second temple actually were. And those places are for people who are ritually unclean. You can't go there, and we're all ritually unclean to one degree or another.
Okay, what doesn't it matter to Yehuda Etzion and Yehuda Glick and all these people?
So these people. Okay, I don't know that it doesn't matter, but in other words, what's happened is that since Rabbi Goren, and other people, so ways of practically going up on Temple Mount and sort of saying that you can go up to these areas and not go into other areas. That's all well known today. You can go up to the steps of the Dome of the Rock. You can't go into the Dome of the Rock. That's A. B, of course, let's say in 1967, and, the paratroopers who took Temple Mount included, many well-known religious figures, included Hanan Parat and included Menachem Froman himself, and included Yoel Ben Nun, along with Udi Adiv and all kinds of other people from the kibbutz movement. So when you're talking about actual conquering and fighting and stuff like that, so there's no argument that you can go into Temple Mount.
Yeah.
So, so he would claim that in the course of taking possession of Temple Mount,
it's Pekuach Nefesh.
Yeah, or it's Kibush Eretz Israel or whatever.
Right.
It's fulfillment, public mitzvah of conquering the land of Israel, especially Temple Mount.
Right.
So I would imagine that's also he never really addresses this explicitly. It's sort of understood that these halachot either on the everyday level can be dealt with practically because we haven't enough guidelines to know how to do this. And B, and if in times of, emergency, fighting, etc., then you can do it anyway because that's the...
Do you think that the Yehuda Glick perspective is gaining traction within these circles?
I think that what's happening is that, and this is not in the article explicitly, But I think that I've addressed this issue on other occasions. I think that until very recently, the religious Zionists and the Israeli right were taken up with the Israeli left. In other words, you have to understand that the Israeli right or the religious Zionists have different priorities than let's say, left of center and leftist groups, centrist groups, etc., have a different set of priorities. I can explain why, but I won't go into it.
You mean nationally or for Temple Mount?
No, nationally, in general.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they're much more concerned. The real issue that they're concerned with is establishing Jewish control and sovereignty over the greater land of Israel. Now, they're not oblivious to the fact that there are over 2 million Palestinians living there. They know that. They get rocks thrown at them all the time, so they know that. But the question is, how do they prioritize solving that? And to them, that's a secondary question. First, let's establish sovereignty. That's the main issue. We establish sovereignty, we'll see what we do with these people. And then, Smotrich, of course, has his solutions, other people have their solutions. So now what's happened, but it seems that from an inner Israeli perspective, this issue has been resolved. And it's been resolved in favor of the right. The right has won. That's what it seems. Every election, the right, almost every election gets a majority. It's clear that most of including the Yair Lapid, it's clear that most of the electorate is in favor of right-wing policies vis-a-vis the greater land of Israel. So now what's happened is that people say, okay, we won the real question about what will be the disposition of the greater land of Israel. All right, what are we going to do with these 2 million people? So now people sort of have space to think about what are we going to do with these 2 million people.
Mm-hmm. Some would say there are more, but that's
2.6 million, 2.3 million, whatever. It doesn't matter to me. That's
no. That's just
what are you going to do with all these people? And hence, so then you have ideas are starting to float. The left always said to the religious Zionists, so what are you going to do? What's your solution? You have no solution. Our solution is the only solution on the table. So now people are starting to think, no, it's not. We're now starting to think about that, and we're providing various solutions, some of which are more acceptable than others, ranging from member of Knesset Smotrich's solutions, which are somewhat extreme, to on the contrary. So people say, so Menachem Froman has an idea. In other words, that he said very explicitly, to love the land of Israel means to love the people who are in the land of Israel. It doesn't mean to chase them out or expel them or kill them or whatever. It means to accept them as part of the land of Israel. Hence, we have to have connection with them. So people say, okay, that we don't know how to translate that exactly into practical terms, but that's an interesting perspective. Mm-hmm. So people are willing to listen at this point because they say, okay, the central issue has been resolved. Central issue has been resolved. We need now to resolve this practical issue somehow, and we're willing to think out of the box.
Mm-hmm. So the more radical solutions on the one hand and the more conciliatory solutions on the other, who do you think is winning?
Oh, that's very difficult to tell. It's sort of very soupy at this point. It's sort of,
mm-hmm.
but listen, they get airtime. They get published in Makor Rishon. I mean, like both Menachem Froman and Rav Shagar are figures that everybody today knows about. They're no longer marginal. I would imagine that most conventional people probably go in the direction of, let's say if I were to say there are 3 solutions, there's also President Rivlin's solution, mm-hmm. and President Rivlin's solution has a lot of traction as a sort of middle path that we annex the territories, and we give Palestinians rights because we're a liberal country, mm-hmm. and people, I mean, very respectable people in Yehuda v'Shomron have sort of told me that they identify with President Rivlin. So, you have a whole spectrum of solutions. What's going to be in the end? Well, we'll see.
We'll see, yeah. All right, Dr. Shlomo Fischer, you're a sociologist specializing in religious groups in Israel, teaching at the School of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for coming in today and discussing with us your paper From Yehuda Etzion to Yehuda Glick, From Redemptive Revolution to Human Rights on the Temple Mount. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And
also big thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support, as well as to Paul Sham, who suggested this item in the first place. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. My co-host Dalia Shendlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, join us again next week, as always, for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.